This is Matt Clark. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Horticultural Science, and thank you for joining in our first webinar. And many thanks go out to Annie Klodd, Lisa Smiley, and John Thull, who are actually going to lead you through a presentation this evening and kind of recap what they were seeing and what we've been hearing, not just in Minnesota, but across the Midwest, and make some comments about our growing season. And I'm just here to facilitate. I'm lucky I got back into town. I was traveling today to a multi-state meeting talking to other grape researchers, and got delayed, and then I missed a flight. But now I'm here, so I get to just kind of listen in, and I'm going to moderate tonight's discussion. So if you see in most people's lower right-hand corner, you will see a chat box. That's your way to communicate with us. So if you have a question, what you can do is type that in, and then I will interrupt if necessary, or we'll ask some of those questions as we go along. And then at the end, we're going to leave about 15 minutes for question and answer, so there's also a time there to ask those. If you're listening by phone or joined us by phone and you can't see or leave a comment, we're going to open it up to people on the phone at the end also, so that you can ask a question using your voice. So hopefully there's no questions about that. And then the other comment, just to make that if possible, if you are logged in and you have a microphone or your computer has a microphone on it, you can just mute yourself. It'll make it a lot easier for everyone else so we don't get feedback. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Annie. And again, thanks for listening in. And we're really excited to do this for the first time and hear people's comments and hear from some of the experts who've been all across the state. So here you go, Annie.
All right. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. All right. So first, I'm just going to give a real quick timeline overview of the season, and then we're going to go into more detail. So this year, bud break happened from about May 5th to May 10th, depending on the variety. We were about a week above average there, or a week later than average otherwise, but it wasn't quite as late as some of us anticipated with that late cold in April. But temperatures were pretty warm from about May to July, so we were able to catch up to our normal maturity timeline. And then we had raisins starting about late July, about July 29th in the metro area is when our raisins started. Harvested DHRC started about August 25th with Edelweiss was our first variety, and that's about average timing on that. And then harvest timing was relatively normal compared to average. And then so we had a pretty normal timeline this year relative to the norm. The thing that I kept hearing over and over again during harvest was quantity was low, but quality was high. So yields were variable. Some people reported pretty normal yields, but I did also hear some reports of yields about 20 to 40% down from normal. I had some anomaly reports of 80 to 90% yield losses. Those were typically losses that happened during ripening. A few things that happened during ripening this year where we had 2 to 3 spells of rain in some places that equated to hail as well, and then there was a pretty hot period between those 2 rains that contributed to some of our losses of fruit during that period. Those rainy periods caused some splitting in the berries, which led to bunch rots and some berry shrivel. Those were the 2 most cited reasons for yield losses during ripening. There was also some vine winter injury from spring of 2018, winter of 2018. So hopefully when John gets on, he can talk to us about that. But in general, I was hearing about pretty good bricks and good pH. There's always a lot of variation here, but that was the general norm that I was hearing throughout the state. So Lisa Smiley helped us a great deal to put on this webinar tonight, and she was able to share some of her observations from the season. And I'm just going to give a summary of some of those observations here, and she is down in Cannon Valley. In the spring, they were about 3 weeks late with pruning. I think this was normal for a lot of folks because of our mid-April snowstorms. And then they sprayed for flea beetles in the spring. Flea beetles are something I'm going to get into later, but they don't happen every year. They're kind of rare, but this was a heavy year for flea beetles, it seemed. All right, the summer for them was hot and dry, as it was for some of us around the state as well, especially the early summer, late May into June. They did do some leaf removal to create airflow through those clusters, and they think that really helped them minimize rots. That is one of the main recommendations we make for minimizing the risk of bunch rots. And then they did not have nearly as many laterals. They are dealing with a little bit of magnesium deficiency in their vines this year, especially in Frontenac Gris. This is something that sometimes happens, so we're going to talk about getting, some petiole tests and soil tests taken for that. And they, as many of us did, had Japanese beetles, something we're going to get into later as well. Harvest 1 to 2 weeks ahead, but the vines are in good condition to overwinter with good lignification, which is very important. I'm going to give a summary of the weather. So overall in the state, temperatures were pretty much average or slightly above. We did have several notable warm periods throughout the summer, but as you can see in this map, in all of the gray areas had just about normal temperatures for the year. All right, so if in the yellow areas here, they were just 1 or 2 degrees above normal over the season. What, of course, is more important is when we had those temperature swings. So during veraison, we had temperatures that were actually slightly below average, which may be surprising depending on what area of the state you are in, because it seemed like we had a pretty warm veraison, but we did have a couple rainy periods that brought those average temperatures down. As far as precipitation, this map to the right here is showing the precipitation over the entire growing season. So what I did was calculate from about April 1st to October 23rd. And so this is the total accumulation that we got. And as you can see on this graph, going from yellow being about 60% of normal precipitation for your area and up to 200%, so twice as much precipitation as normal. You can see that the southern third of the state had, about 50 to 75% higher than normal precipitation. So it was a really wet season down there. But the south central and southeast part of the state, you were actually average precipitation for most of the season, but what's contributing to this is that you had a pretty wet September. The west central part of the state had average precipitation for that area throughout the summer, but there was some hail reported midsummer, about late June, early July. So we started out the season, of course, with this big record-breaking blizzard, April 13th through 15th, that dropped quite a bit of snow in southern Minnesota. So you can see some of those numbers of precipitation on the left-hand side. So for the Twin Cities, this actually did set a record. And that got us off to a little bit of a slow start, but gave some folks some extra weeks to prune. The next major precipitation event over the state was about mid-June. So this map on the left is precipitation between June 13th and 19th. So you can see there's some heavy rains throughout the state, and that might have affected some disease issues that we had. And then, so this map on the right, what this is a cumulative precipitation from the beginning of the growing season to June 19th. So you can see the southern part of the state starting to get pretty wet. Mid-July, this area of the state north of the Twin Cities did get a big rain event as well, and I know that contributed to some potential insect and disease issues that we'll talk about later. And then by late August, we've still got that southwest part of the state pretty wet, but most of the other parts of the state are looking average, except this area north of the cities. And so then mid-September, between the 19th and 25th, a couple of days in there, we just had quite a bit of rain in the southern half of the state. That was a pretty big one, and that did have some disease and yield implications. That's that big storm that was preceded by a lot of heat, and so there were some bunch rot and some necrosis issues associated with that put some yields down. All right, so is John Thull here?
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Awesome. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, why don't you start talking about what you observed in the winter and the early season, and hopefully your connection will stay strong.
Okay. All right. If you guys can hear me, I'll try to talk loud. Seems okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right. In we're talking about 2018, and the photos that you see, we were noticing some of these huge cracks forming in some of our vines, and I was trying to wonder like what was leading up to that. And the previous season, I had a couple of comments about we had this really dry fall leading up to 2018. So the end of 2017, pretty dry. We didn't have that much snow even through December and January. And I feel like we did get a little bit chilly in that time, like around New Year's. So the frost was going down deep in the ground, and we didn't have any snow cover. So you add to that pretty low humidity and a lot of desiccating type of wind in that time period. Even though our temperatures really didn't get that low, it was like minus 16 around the HRC. It seemed like something was going on, like drying out these vines to cause this kind of cracking. So we knew something was up at that point already. And it was warming up. By the time February and March came around, we were warming up pretty good. And yeah, as things were thawing out, the ground was thawing, and the vines were kind of rehydrating. We saw these cracks forming. But yeah, that April snowstorm that happened for sure. That was
we've seen it
that was helping to maybe rehydrate
promoting
things.
But,
yeah, that following weekend we saw like almost 80 degrees or 90 degrees right afterwards. So pretty crazy. And then it stayed warm. It just stayed warm. So like the heat was coming like a freight train for us, and keeping everything rolling. The shoots were going fast. Everything was going fast as soon as it started growing. So, and what else happened? I guess we were thinking that harvest was going to come sooner. At least the benefits of all that heat is that the fruit really ripened up nice. Even though August might have kind of ticked down a little bit as far as temperatures. But it wasn't bad. It was good. We had a lot of good fruit chemistry going on. The juice chemistry was coming up. Sugars were coming up. Acids were dropping nicely. We had really good numbers when it did come to harvest. But kind of weaving through that September, there was a lot of rainfall, and it was wet periods, and also some really hot spikes in there. So it was tricky to get the things harvested. But all in all, I think we did pretty well. The yields were probably lower, but the fruit quality was way up, I feel like, and we can already taste that in the tanks. The only thing that I see kind of problematic right now is that we had this abrupt cold in the last week or so, and we dipped down to 9 degrees last Friday, and then this past Monday it was down to 6, so that was pretty cold pretty quickly. Maybe that was a week ago already, but yeah, Friday the 9th, it was down to 9 degrees, and then Monday the 12th, it was 6. So yeah, not all that long ago. Mm-hmm. So we could be seeing some bud damage, but as a general rule, I would think that the wood ripening was really good, so we're set up and we're poised really well for next season at this point. So.
John, there's a question. So the cracked vines that you showed, Dennis is wondering, did those vines die, or how do you manage those?
Yeah, those vines did not die. They actually, once they healed up, or once they filled with water again, they sort of came back together. I mean, not perfectly, but there's definitely a lot of like injury, and that's going to be a point for always like future injury, whether it's from fungus or from cold. That's not a good thing to have those splits. But they did live, at least in the interim, for this season. But our plan would be, if we noticed that and it was getting bad enough, we were going to grow new cordons or new trunks and start replacing that kind of stuff. So, and let's see. I think down a couple of slides, the next slide here, and next one after that. Yeah, they were always associated with big pruning wounds. But this slide right here, if you can see that this happened like in 2012 into 13. It's like 5 years ago right now. We saw the vines looking just exactly like they did this year. Not in all cases. I mean, you can see some good vines in there. But the vines that were really susceptible to getting cold injured, they look pretty rough. So we had just a couple of shoots growing, hardly any suckers on those vines. Same scenario, a lot of cracks and stuff going on. So let's see, who do I have? If you can advance the slide for me, Annie, or whoever got control of that.
Is this the one you want, John?
Yeah. Here you can see like how the roots in some seasons really froze out. So I feel like that happened a little bit in this past season, especially when we had that open winter. So when the roots freeze that hard, sometimes they can rebuild, and you can see there's some new roots that grew during the season. This is a photo again from 2013. But I feel like there's a certain amount of our vines were looking like that this year as well. And what's on the next photo there? Next slide, please. Yeah, so it's just more of that similar stuff. When you feel like your vines are not performing the way they should be, I think your best bet is just start growing up new suckers, or start training in new cordons or new canes for replacements of those cordons, and just keep an eye on your vines. Keep inspecting what's going on from year to year. And a lot of this is things that you can reconstruct the vines or rejuvenate with new cane growth or new shoot growth, but you got to have a plan in place. When it starts to decline or there's some injuries that are happening, you got to start taking almost proactive measures to start fixing that versus waiting until they collapse completely. All right? I think that's about it.
All right, thanks, John. Feel free to chime in later if you want to say anything else.
Sure. I'll mute again now. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to talk about a few insect pests we encountered in 2018. These aren't necessarily new, but Japanese beetle has been around, quite a long time, actually decades, but it comes and goes. There are some years that it's really bad, and a lot of years, though, when Japanese beetles are not bad at all. So it's kind of interesting that there hasn't been a ton of research done on Japanese beetle biology or control, and that's because they come in spurts. And so they'll be bad for a couple of years, there'll be a lot of interest, but then they'll go away again. And so the research interest will go to something else. But there is a lot of research going on at the university for Japanese beetles, since it is a current problem in Minnesota. So they're heavy in certain areas. I want to show a distribution map, but MDA has taken it down. But it's heaviest around the Twin Cities and going out from there. So southern, central, and east central Minnesota, but it's still spreading throughout the state. You'll see them a lot in July through August if there are Japanese beetles in your area, and we saw them especially heavy around the beginning of veraison. So without a spray program, they'll really accumulate. One will send out pheromones when they start chewing on a leaf, and those pheromones actually attract others. So that's why you'll rarely ever see one Japanese beetle. You'll see a big swarm of them around the vines, and if you try to go underneath those, that vine canopy might get them falling on your head, which happened to me a lot this summer. So three pesticide options for Japanese beetle are Baythroid, Danitol, and Sevin. All right, spotted wing Drosophila is another one that we're dealing with in certain parts of Minnesota. Again, this one, kind of like Japanese beetle, it seems to be spreading throughout the state. This was first identified in Minnesota in 2012. It's a pest of soft-skinned berries. So for raspberries and strawberries and blueberries, it's the worst. And they do infect grapes. But typically on grapes, they're mainly just an issue on damaged and ripe berries. So, on softer skinned varieties, we have actually seen them digging into undamaged grapes, but that is more rare. And it's much more common for them to be a problem in grapes that have split due to some stress, like cold stress. So when grapes are split and are infected by spotted wing Drosophila, there can be some sour rot issues brought on by those insects. So one good thing to prevent sour rot is to prevent spotted wing Drosophila infestation. So if you see grapes starting to split, getting in there with a good insecticide spray to control SWD can then in turn help control sour rot. All right, so with flea beetles, these only come every few years badly, so they're actually rare as the cause for low fruiting. They're usually just most common around the field borders. So if you're experiencing low fruiting over the whole field, it's likely due to something else. But if you have low fruiting or low bud counts on the borders of the field, it's a good idea to check for flea beetles. These come out obviously right at the beginning of the seed and they chew on those buds during bud swell. So if bud swell goes on for a long time, there's more of a chance that we're going to have a bad flea beetle infestation. So if you physically see the insect and you can see the mature insects feeding on the buds or the larvae feeding on the leaves, you can apply Danazol and 7. The recommendation from the
control the moose population.
The recommendation from the University of Minnesota is to not spray unless the insects are actually spotted and you have more than 5% damage. This is the threshold for flea beetles to actually cause sizable damage on yield. Danazol can also hit Phylloxera, so if you have both of those pests at the same time, that can serve a double duty there. Diseases that I want to mention, I won't go through all of these in detail, but these are some that, we saw this summer. A lot of these are not surprising, but one thing I noticed is even in some vineyards I visited that are doing really good spray programs, we still saw some Phomopsis forming and some anthracnose. So I just wanted to mention these two because they have similar looking symptoms on the shoots. So this picture on the left is a shoot that tested positive for Phomopsis. And so we know that these lesions on that shoot are from Phomopsis. However, if you look at this picture of anthracnose on the right, it looks very similar, so they can be very hard to tell apart. One of the distinguishing factors is that Phomopsis lesions usually form at the base of the shoots, whereas anthracnose lesions can happen anywhere on the shoot. But the ways to tell the differences on mature berries is with Phomopsis, the whole berry will shrivel, and this is because that lesion on that shoot is actually girdling the cluster, and then it will cause necrosis in the cluster stems followed by drying up of the berries. Whereas with anthracnose, this is the kind of symptomology you see, that bullseye on the berries. With both of these, they're typically happening on immature grapes before veraison. All right, so bunch rots, this was a big issue this year. As I said before, we had a couple big rains with a big warm period in between them during the height of our ripening season. So it was wet and warm during ripening. Another thing that can contribute to bunch rots are the condition of the canopy and the clusters. So if you have really tight clusters and you have a thick canopy, there's a lot of moisture that's going to accumulate there, and it has a hard time getting out. So those are conditions for bunch rot. So if we have wet, warm conditions with the weather, we can't really control that, but opening up that canopy more will allow the canopy to dry out faster, so the vineyard is more resilient to that. It infects injured berries typically. It can definitely infect non-injured berries, but injured berries that have been split by rain are a lot more vulnerable. Botrytis is one of our bunch rots that's common in Minnesota relatively. It's really hard to tell from sour rot, but the difference is with sour rot you can smell kind of a vinegar smell, and because it's bacterial, but botrytis is a fungal disease, and so you won't be able to smell that vinegar smell. Elevate, Ravel, Scala, Switch, and Vanguard are some of the fungicide options for that. The recommendation is to spray them after bloom and then before rainy periods. And an early spray program is really important for this, for keeping our vines healthy so they're not as susceptible to bunch rots. Hail damage was something that was reported both in the Mankato area and in west central Minnesota. So this is what it looks like kind of earlier on. I'm sure many in the audience have seen hail damage on grapes before. You get these, subtle kind of browning, bruising spots on the grapes, and then those will shrivel. And that's a place that diseases can get into. All right, so Lisa and Keith were kind enough to give me some information on the spray program approach that they use. Based on advice from Wayne Wilcox at Cornell, they go spraying the first 3 sprays are critical for preventing disease throughout the season. And so they really focus on getting a good spray program early on. Mandate, which is Mancozeb, and Quintec are 2 that they focus on in the early season. They switched away from Raleigh to Quintec this year due to resistance. So if we're using the same chemical every year, multiple times a year, that creates conditions where the fungi can develop resistance to that. So it's a good idea to try to switch up those types of chemicals, those chemical families that we're using in order to try to slow resistance to these chemicals that we really value. They were also spraying this year potassium silicate in the early to mid-season. Potassium silicate is one of the options for spraying on powdery mildew. They were also spraying it in an effort to strengthen the rachises and the cluster stems on lucrescent, try to prevent some of that shattering that lucrescent can have, and also in an effort to minimize bunch stem necrosis. So that was something that they felt they had success with. Late season, phosphorus acid for downy mildew, and then they used 7 for flea beetles and a sale for phylloxera. In all of these cases, they were actually scouting to make sure that they had these insects before applying those, just to make sure that each application is actually effective and they're not doing excess pesticide applications. Another big issue this year that I know there have been a lot of conversations about are unproductive cordons. And John talked about this earlier, and how winter injury can have a big effect on the health of our woody tissue in our vine. So these are a couple examples of things we saw this year. You can see with this vine on the left, it is largely dead wood, but it does have suckers coming out from the bottom. This is something we see a lot. On the right, too, it's just another example of an unproductive cordon. There can be multiple reasons for this, like what John was saying earlier with winter injury. There was also a lot of discussion this summer about grapevine trunk diseases. And so this is something with these trunk diseases that we have applied for funding to study more. So you'll be hearing a lot more about these, but trunk diseases may or may not be contributing to these dieback problems that we are seeing in Minnesota. So it's something that we will be investigating further. Overcropping is something that can also contribute to low fruiting. So if you've seen conditions where you have a great healthy crop one year and then a very low crop the next year, it could be something having to do with overcropping. So if the vine is putting a lot of energy into producing a lot of clusters, we're talking like 10,000 pounds per acre one year, then the next year it's tired and it's not going to produce as much. So there are a lot of reasons why we can have unproductive vines, and just trying to think through those reasons and do a little investigating into the health of the vines and thinking about what are the potential factors that have happened on the vineyard in the past couple of years that could be influencing that is really important. So winter injury, potentially trunk disease, and potentially overcropping are just some of those factors. With trunk diseases and winter injury, one of the main really important recommendations is if you have unproductive wood, go ahead and don't be afraid to train down a new cordon or train up a new sucker if the damage is down to the trunk, because we want to keep new healthy wood free. Grapevine trunk disease, this is a few pictures of cross-sections of cordons like we were talking about. These were taken this summer, so they can take on different appearances. The one on the left was taken during Richard Smart's workshop out at the HRC, and that's a pretty severe case. You cannot tell just from looking at a cross-section of a vine what trunk disease species it is. I know there was a lot of talk about Botryophyria, but we have done some DNA testing throughout Iowa, thanks to Mike, and in Minnesota, and we found several different trunk disease species, but so far we have not identified Botryophyria. So that's important to point out that there can be many different species of these trunk diseases, and but either way, we still recommend if you have some trunk disease issues that are affecting the productivity of your vine to go ahead and train down new shoots, new cordons to get healthy wood growing. Vines can also keep growing perfectly fine with these trunk diseases, but it's when the vine gets stressed that the trunk diseases can really take advantage of that situation and propagate. So this is something that may be contributing to cordon decline, and we'll be looking into that. Bunch stem necrosis is another big issue that I spent a lot of time talking to folks about this summer. It's something that when I started in January, I had some growers contact me right away about this issue. And what they said every time was, my vines look great all season, and then a couple of weeks before I'm ready to pick, the clusters just start shriveling. And it's really unclear why this is happening. So we've been doing some work this summer looking into this problem. What it's called is bunch stem necrosis. It's actually a physiological issue that's happening within the vine. The vine is responding to some sort of stress in its environment, and the xylems, or the transport vessels within the shoots, actually die, and this causes the stems of the clusters to shrivel up and die, followed by the berries. So this is opposed to something like black rot, where the berries shrivel up before the cluster. The cluster stems are actually shriveling up, and then the berries. So that's an important distinction. And why it's important is to understand that bunch stem necrosis is not a disease. So spraying fungicide on it is not known to have any effect on this disorder. There are many different causes that have been proposed for bunch stem necrosis, but in Minnesota, it's much more likely that it's due to something like heavy rain and causing wet feet, just excess water in the soil during ripening, or it could be due to nutrient imbalances in the soil. So we're trying to do more research on this issue. It's going to require, controlled studies to figure out what the best treatments are for this problem. So if you have encountered something like this, go ahead and read the article that we put on the blog, but also please contact me, because we're trying to get an idea of how widely distributed this problem is in Minnesota and surrounding states. Fertility in Minnesota vineyards is something that we had a lot of conversations about this summer as well. I really recommend, if you haven't already, or if it's been a few years, please take a soil and foliar test of your vines to see what their nutrient status is like. The recommendation that soil scientists will make for you is to fertilize only if the soil or the plant is showing deficiencies in a certain nutrient. So if the vine already has adequate nutrition, if you do a soil test and it says the levels are high or very high for different nutrients, that is a good sign. That's a sign that we don't need to go and put on a bunch of fertilizer on that soil, because it already has what it needs. Generally, foliar micronutrients are not needed unless the plant is deficient in those specific micronutrients. There are potentially consequences of applying excess fertilizer, such as excessive nitrogen fertilizer can lead to slow brick accumulation and overly high yield. So this is something that we do want to be really careful about. It can also cause runoff in the environment. Excessive potassium application does prohibit magnesium uptake. This is something that's been well known for decades. So be careful with potassium application as well. And so recommending, just do those soil tests to see if your soil does need nutrients. If it needs those nutrients, by all means. So for Lisa and Keith, we're going to wrap up here and then leave time for questions. Some of the things that went well for Lisa and Keith this year were they had a consistent spray schedule. They had an aggressive canopy management program, like I said earlier, thinning out the canopy, getting airflow through that canopy, and that really helped them prevent disease. So they did not experience massive disease pressure this year, which is obviously a great thing. They did scouting for flea beetles and for Japanese beetles, and by scouting those early, they were able to get to them with their spray program before they were able to have a large effect on those buds and those leaves. So they had strong shoots and branches on La Crescent this year, which was a good thing. They said that the potassium silicate application they did may have contributed to that, so that's great. La Crescent, as we know, has some shattering issues, and they say that may or may not have had an effect on shattering. It's not completely clear. They had no issues with bunch stem necrosis, though, this year, which is just awesome. So for next year, their goals are to address magnesium deficiency, do a petiole test to look at the vine nutrient status and inform that. They also want to look into cover crops, potentially underneath the vines, and bat boxes, trunk disease prevention is another big focus area for them. So a few of my general recommendations looking forward into next year, as for spray program, maybe review your spray program think about spraying based on what diseases are there, remembering that not all fungicides are created equal. So the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide is a wonderful resource for this. There are some great tables for fungicides, insecticides, and herbicides in that guide where you can look and actually see if you have a lot of powdery mildew problems historically, for instance. You can go in there and see which chemicals are actually recommended for the diseases that are putting the most pressure on your vineyard to make sure that your spray program is optimized. Think about replacing unproductive cordons, especially while you're out pruning this winter. If a cordon isn't producing anything, go ahead and think about training a new shoot down for that. Soil and petiole nutrient test is a great idea when the spring comes. It's a little too late this season to do a soil test probably in most parts of the state. And weather forecast. So this is based on a few different sources. We're not looking at a polar vortex at this point in time. They're not predicting that, which is great. We're looking at normal snowfall or slightly below for this year in most parts of Minnesota. Temperatures are going to be slightly above normal throughout the winter. The coldest periods, one of the coldest periods was actually a couple days ago, so got that in early. But early December, early January, and then mid to late February are also predicted to be some of those coldest periods. But we're not expecting that super, super cold that we often get. So early thaws, as far as oddly warm temperatures in April or May, currently they're not forecasting that. They're forecasting a slightly cooler April and May, but I'd still keep, if you're doing a light pruning, keeping a couple insurance buds, I wouldn't recommend stopping that practice. It's still a good idea. So now we have plenty of time for questions, and I'm gonna go back in here to
Great, thanks, Annie.
Of course.
So this is Matt again. I just made a couple of questions. I don't see any populating in our chat box. There's just a comment from Dennis Drummond, just restating that there were some low crops, especially on Marquette. And I think numbers that I've heard from some folks, 25% or so down from last year. And just if there's any comments, maybe from John or from you, Annie, about what that might be. And then a second follow-up question, maybe in the same line, is do you think it's related to wood ripening and the long fall that we had last year? And where do you think this year looks differently since we had some cooler periods and, in my opinion, some pretty good ripening? So I'll turn it over to either of you if you have a response.
All right. I'm going to let John answer that one. I just started my position in January, so I wasn't around last fall.
Okay. If you guys can hear me all right.
Yep, good.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I noticed last year compared to this year is that a temperature dropout in August last year was pretty bad. That just really put the brakes on the ripening and the carbohydrate accumulation. So whatever the vines were producing as far as sugars, it seemed to go to the fruit, but they struggled to ripen that fruit last year. And I don't know about other people's vineyards, but in our own vineyard near Melrose, Minnesota, we had probably one of our highest yields last season in 2017. And 16 was also a pretty high yielding year for us. So two back-to-back pretty high yielding years kind of translated. It was probably going to come, and we knew it. We were pushing our vines, but this year the crop was way down basically because of that. I feel like we didn't, it's that yo-yo effect of having a high yield one year and then the next year is going to be a little bit lower because you don't have the carbohydrates to go into the wood ripening and into the bud formation, the initiation for next season. And this season totally different. I mean, we had so much heat, a lot more heat than last year, and it came consistently throughout the season. Even though we saw maybe a little bit of a slowdown in August, which was kind of nice, we already had made up so much growing degree days throughout the season that it just helped our vines continue to ripen into the fall nicely this year, and plus give that beautiful fruit chemistry. So I feel like we're in good shape for next year. Again, as long as we can get through the winter, right?
Yeah, that would be ideal. I made a couple of thoughts to myself because I wasn't sure if people know where to go about getting a soil test or where they should go to do petiole analysis. So Annie, do you have any recommendations, or were those on the slides that we could go back to? I was just scribbling.
I did not list the links to those on the slides. Midwest Laboratories, a lot of people prefer to go with them. We also, of course, have soil and petiole analysis services at the university. So I will share the link to that in the chat box. But if you can't see the chat box, all you have to do is go online and you Google UMN Soil Testing Laboratory, or just UMN Soil Testing. It's really easy to find. It's probably the first thing that will come up. It's about $25 to do a soil test, and you can do, one soil test on one part of your vineyard that's maybe, let's say, at the top of your hill or has one soil type. You can do a soil test for that. You're going to be taking shovelfuls of soil from different parts of your vineyard underneath the vine, so in the vine row. And you're going to combine those in a bucket, mix them up nicely, and then you take a subsample of that, and that's what you submit to the lab. And that gives them kind of an average of how your soil is across the area of your vineyard. If you have a lot of variation in your vineyard, though, you might want to take more samples. So you would send in various samples for different parts of your vineyard. So if you have one really low-lying area or an area that you're especially concerned with, you might take more samples on there just to get a better idea of how things are looking.
One other comment just regarding soil sampling. I'd certainly like to recommend the University of Minnesota Soil Lab as opposed to going with a service that maybe is trying to sell you fertilizer, just as thinking about conflict of interest there. And of course, if you do a soil test to the university, we always have other resources of people, especially Carl Rosen, for example, who has a number of years experience working with grapevines, doing both the soil and petiole analysis, so we can get information from extension in those areas. So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Carl's great.
Another comment that I was curious about, Annie, you talked just kind of briefly about Japanese beetle, and even just looking at the image you're showing us, we have a lot of turfgrass and a lot of plants that live between our rows and within our plants where Japanese beetles like to go underground and lay their eggs.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if there's a recommendation for treating Japanese beetle grubs in the vineyard, or what you or John might comment about that.
Right. So I got a lot of questions about that this summer, and there are Japanese beetle grub nematodes that can be applied to the soil, and they will attack the Japanese beetles that are burrowed in the soil. But the thing about that is the beetles are in other natural environments, and they can fly a long way. So the general recommendation in the entomology community has really been, if you treat your soil, they're probably just going to come in anyway. So it's really not worth it.
We had another comment from Dennis Drummond about La Crescent, particularly related to no crop and bull canes like crazy, about ready to give up. I know that at the HRC we also had issues with La Crescent in our 2018 season. One of the things that I noticed that's a challenge when we look across all the varieties is that the downy mildew situation on La Crescent is on the leaves has been quite bad the last several years. My hunch right now is that's probably related to the wet falls that we're having, and that most people aren't going in and treating for downy mildew. And so we actually have a lot of La Crescent vines that are defoliated through ripening. Of course, it's happening sort of all season, but those vines just aren't doing any photosynthesis while those fruit are ripening, and I think it's hard for them to get ready to shut down for winter, so I think that could be contributing. I'm not sure if that's the same situation you're seeing up north, Dennis, but it's certainly on our radar here. I don't know if John has any other comments about La Crescent in particular.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the leaves getting downy mildew is a big issue for sure, and you can generally keep it sprayed and keep it under control a little bit better in some cases. But the other thing with the La Crescent is once you get into that bull cane cycle, bull canes, they really don't survive the winter very well, and that's all you get though. Like if your trunk collapses and your vine collapses, you still got this healthy root that's under the ground. It's ready to support, however many shoots it normally wants to support, depending on the age of the vine. So, your vine might want to take care of like 40 shoots with fruit on it. It has that kind of root potential, but when you only got like 4 or even up to 10 suckers coming out of the ground, a lot of those are going to become bully, and it's just hard to get out of that cycle. Definitely, if your lucrescent does die back that hard, trying to keep multiple sucker shoots is the best practice, and you got to go in when you go to prune, try to select those shoots that are not overly vigorous or overly bully, and prune those guys out, and then retain the ones that are a little bit more moderate. I always call them Goldilocks shoots, but it is a messy process, and the more north you go, the harder it's going to be to handle it because of winter dieback and whatnot all, and it's just tricky. It's a tricky vine for sure. It's not for the beginner grower, I don't think.
Thanks, John. We had a comment from Jameson. He's asking, does a fungus survive over the winter, and what is the earliest we should start spraying? Is a dormant spray recommended? So Jameson, if you're still there, can you clarify what fungus in particular? Of course, most of the fungi that we deal with, powdery mildew, downy mildew, black rot, and all of the things that we treat like fungi do overwinter on canes, trunks, cordons, especially older ones. They start to accumulate. As a best management practice, you should try to remove or mulch cuttings and so forth within your row. That's a recommended practice in most crops as a way to either disrupt sexual cycles that are occurring in the late winter or during the fall. So just as a general rule of practice, they're there in the vineyard year-round. They're not living on alternate hosts like in some other crops. They're in the vineyard, they're on the trunks and canes. So that's another good reason to continue thinking about replacing trunks and cordons, is because they just accumulate pathogens on their outsides in addition to some of the trunk disorders that Annie mentioned. So let me...
Somebody asked a question about...
powdery and downy mildew. I'm sorry, I guess my thing stopped scrolling. So Annie, it looks like you looked at, maybe you're up to date with the questions?
Yeah. I just wanted to real quick make sure I answered this question because it's a quick one. Somebody asked if these slides or the webinar will be available. We're actually recording the webinar right now, so it's going to be available on our Enology University of Minnesota blog afterward, and we'll make sure you get the word about that.
Mike White made a comment that chickens and ducks love Japanese beetles, and that's awesome. So if that's something you want to implement in your vineyard, I think that's a strategy. Is there a recommendation for dormant spraying for fungi? Powdery and downy mildew in particular?
I don't know, Matt. I mean, if anybody has a comment about that, please chime in. But I generally hear like the liquid lime sulfur spray that you could do as a dormant spray. It's good for anthracnose mostly. The other mildews are sort of holding a little more tight or a little more dormant, and not as easily scrubbed out with that lime sulfur. But the lime sulfur does have some residual effect. I mean, it stinks for quite a long time if you do that as a dormant spray before bud break. So it may have some carryover effect in the weeks to come. And that would, generally those dormant sprays are right before the buds swell open, before you get green tissue, if you're going to do them.
Without having it in front of me, I think what was suggested that the Smileys have done, and that's recommendation from Wayne Wilcox and what the Midwest Spray Guide is, that your real key time for spraying for fungicides for control of powdery mildew, downy mildew, and the like are at right before, during, and after bloom. That's when the tissues that are most of interest to us are most susceptible. So the flower clusters in particular, and it's also a good time because in most cases they're nicely exposed in the canopy. So to me, spraying a dormant spray when the tissues that are going to be infected that are most important aren't there and your spores aren't actively being spread around the vineyard could be a waste of money. So it seems like most people have a lot of success when they get their timing right and their sprays right right before bloom and after bloom. And then, of course, the Midwest Spray Guide is a good place to turn to that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry?
I was just going to say exactly that. The 2 sprays, if you can get those 2 sprays before bloom, a couple of weeks apart when you got green vegetation, those are really critical in keeping your vines clean. And then a spray or 2 after the bloom, it's done. It's usually pretty good, especially with our varieties that have a lot of disease resistance built into them.
I'm just going to make a comment because Annie brought it up about spotted wing Drosophila. We've been studying that for 2 seasons now at the Research Center with Bill Hutchison over in our entomology department and graduate students and technicians. And we actually have not been successful with rearing out or basically hatching any spotted wing Drosophila from 32 out of 34 different varieties that we've tested. And the ones that we have, one is a breeding line and one is Vanessa, which is a table grape that's not cold hardy. So that isn't to say you don't have spotted wing Drosophila in your vineyards. It just doesn't seem like they're really taking advantage of whole berries and ovipositing or laying their eggs in those fruit. They certainly move in when you have other fruit flies that are in your fruit because of bird damage, splitting. Even right at the top of the pedestal where the berries attached to the rachis, that's kind of one of the first places that's sort of thin and might have some micro cracks. That's a place where all of the fruit flies are able to get in and start laying their eggs. And so they've got a pretty fast cycle for reproduction, maybe 7 to 10 days. And so the recommendation really is if you want to control for sour rot and VA in your grapes, you need to be spraying for your fruit flies. Mustang Max, of course, has the short harvest interval. It works really well. The problem is we're seeing in places like New York, in some controlled studies, they're able to see those populations evolve and become resistant to the sprays really quickly. So just as a comment, we need to be thinking about different modes of taking care of fruit flies in general, and spotted wing Drosophila is just another one. We're hoping that the graduate student on that project is writing up her thesis right now, so we're hoping we can share some of those results during this winter.
Hey, this is Annie. So you guys are more than welcome to keep chatting. I'm going to keep the webinar open, so if John and Matt can stick around and answer questions, I have to run. So thank you for attending the webinar, and hopefully you have a great winter season.
Great, thanks, Annie. I think we can do maybe 5 more minutes, and I just wanted to read what Mike White wrote in the chat box for those people who are on the phone. So thanks, Mike, for always commenting about what's happening in Iowa and sharing your expertise. So in regards to dormant sprays, Mike says, I typically recommend liquid lime sulfur or sulfurics just before bud break for primarily anthracnose and phomopsis. So thanks for that. And in Iowa, it gives some, he says, in quotations, powdery mildew control, and it makes a big difference. So there's something to keep in mind that there are other diseases than powdery and downy mildew at bloom that we're worried about that you can control with some of those sprays. So thank you for that. Jessica Youngblood, thanks for your question. Jessica's in Michigan, and she's wondering, are there varieties that are too sensitive for sulfur sprays? I don't have that list off the top of my head. I think that's typically in the Labrusca family of vines, but that's out of my wheelhouse, so I don't have an answer to that. I don't know, John, if you have a comment. I think the Midwest Spray Guide has some of that information. We can do some digging and see if we can get that information either on our enology website or attach it to the seminar, Jessica, so we can get that answer to you.
Yep, you're right, Matt. Mostly Labrusca varieties, but again, it's not so bad if it's used prior enough to the bud swelling. You can avoid that injury pretty good if you give it enough time to air out before those buds are actually growing in the stuff, and never spray it on the leaves themselves for those Libresca varieties.
Do we have any questions from people on the phone who maybe didn't actually get to see the presentation? I'd be happy to let you chime in. I'm excited to see people from all over the country. I see Bob Thaden, who's out in Montana. Jessica from Michigan, like I said. Mike from Iowa. Carl Camper. I see him in the list. So it's really exciting that you guys all came to participate and our first chance at doing something like this. So maybe we'll give it another minute or two to see if there's any follow-up questions. When's the next webinar? Awesome question. We'll have to talk to Annie about that and see what topics people are interested in. So what I think you can expect for your participation, everyone probably provided an email address. It's likely that we're going to send out a follow-up survey just to gauge what you thought, what we can do to improve, because we want to make sure we're answering questions and helping provide as many resources as possible to you. So look forward to getting that assessment, and that'll be coming out within the next week. And feel free to give information, and we'll certainly try to ask a question. I'll make a note of this about what other topics specifically you want covered. And also if this time works for people. It looks like we had a pretty good turnout, and again, just try to go forward and do the right things. So there was one comment. Tom Novacek in southwest Wisconsin said they had 25 inches of rain in 5 days in late August. We lost 95%. Anything that can be done? Not that I can think of, Tom. You sound like a lot of the growers who are on the East Coast who had rain all season long, something they're not used to dealing with, who are really experiencing crop loss. Not as bad as you, 40 to 60% is what I just heard from Joe Fiola out from Maryland, who said things haven't looked real that great. So 25 inches of rain is hard on any crop. So I don't know what one could do at that point. Really unfortunate. All right. Jameson, another comment. Maybe this will be our last one. He wants to know, are there good ways of spreading organic matter? I'm guessing that's what he means by OM. John, you have any suggestions there? What type of organic matter do you have, Jameson?
Right. If it's like kind of composted manure or something? I don't know. I guess you just the old-fashioned way and shovel it out. You could have. I mean, maybe there's a small spreader device that could like spread it out in between your rows, but I don't know. Yeah,
I'd have a great answer for that. Maybe you want to follow up with an email to Annie. She might have some ideas. Pumice or compost manure. Manure spreader sounds like the best idea if you can get it between your rows and make your turns. There are small spreaders. Dennis has some ideas for you, Jameson, so maybe you two can share that information with one another. That's okay. All caps is just fine with me. Well, great. So thank you, everybody, for participating. I know Annie had to get out of here. A long day for her, and she had some other stuff she needs to work on. So we appreciate your feedback, again, about what we can do better, and look forward to more of these as we go forward. Thanks, John. Thanks to Lisa and Keith, and also thanks to Annie for putting this together. Have a great night, everybody.
See you guys. Thank you.